Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Headfirst into Hell by Horace Mccoy. Black Mask, May 1931. Captain Jerry Frost and Eddie Giles bust some clouds in Manana Land. This story is a high-stakes pulp adventure set in the golden age of pulp fiction, with crime thriller and aerial combat elements. The story explores themes of courage under fire, loyalty, and survival amidst intense danger. It follows classic pulp heroes, hardened, resourceful individuals facing relentless challenges, moral ambiguity, and personal sacrifice. There's a subtext of camaraderie, as well as a romantic tension between the protagonist and a mysterious female character, contributing to a rugged yet emotional undertone. Almost as soon as the wheels of his little black ship had touched the landing field at Valbuena in Mexico City, it was apparent to Captain Jerry Frost that this revolution was not being regarded with the customary Latin indifference. On every side, there were unmistakable signs that the Tento uprising plainly was not being taken lightly. Armed troops were on patrol. The attitude of the field attendants was crisp, so crisp it bordered on hostility. There was a tension that tightened the throat. Captain Montez hurried into a hangar and conversed with an officer. Presently they returned to the roadway and signaled an automobile. It rolled up quickly. On its windshield was a gum poster, a flag of Mexico and the seal, an eagle holding a serpent entwined in its talons. It was the presidential insignia. Montez nodded, and Frost and Giles stepped in. Montez sat beside the driver, and Frost and Giles were in the back seat. They were guest players, these two, temporarily resigned from the Rangers. They had been borrowed for a little work below the border. Montez said, "We are to meet the president at once." Eddie Giles frowned and took off his helmet. He ran his fingers through his hair. "Say, I don't want to meet anybody until I have a chance to wash," Frost cut in. "You haven't got time to pour perfume on your hair, Jellybean. We are now mixed up in a war." "Yeah?" Giles said. "I guess the last 6 months have been a house party." Captain Montez felt impelled to arbitrate and half-turned to say over his shoulder, "After you see the president, there will be time to bathe." Frost said, "Sure," and nudged Giles. He pointed off in the distance. He said, "Popo." Giles said, "Who?" "Popocatépetl volcano. The smaller one is Ixtachihuatl." "Oh," Giles said blandly, "volcanoes." "Yeah, volcanoes. Nice little places where they dump wisecrackers." Giles chuckled and sat back. The car rolled along a road that was like glass, fairly eating up the miles to the city, which was now visible through the mauve mists. Occasionally they roared by a surprised Federalista who, recognizing the emblem on the windshield, came smartly to what Mexican soldiers humorously call attention. All of them stared after the car. Montez leveled a finger ahead. "Castillo de Chapultepec," he said. "Home of the president." The castle sat atop a rugged forested peak, and it was a citadel that might have delighted a feudal baron. And too, it bore a strange resemblance to the lonely fortress the Negro Christophe erected a century ago in the Haitian jungles. Nowhere south of Cancer is there similar architecture. Fighting men ever have been surprised and delighted with the strategic possibilities of the Castillo de Chapultepec. Giles sucked in his breath sharply and said, "I could take a machine gun squad and hold that place against the world." He leaned over and stared, fascinated. Frost nodded. "Yeah, I guess you could in the old days. But now somebody would lay an egg on you and whoosh." He pantomimed the dropping of a bomb. 2 sentries with fixed bayonets approached and saluted. They turned to the interior and shouted, "Capitan Montez!" Their shouts attracted the crowd, and they surged around and stared in undisguised curiosity. The gates swung open, and the car moved through. Inside it stopped again, and the gates went to with a clank. Montez, Frost, and Giles got out. They walked into an outside corridor and climbed a wide, thickly carpeted flight of stairs. Two officers passed Montez and saluted sharply. They moved to an inner door, and without ceremony, Montez threw it open and preceded Frost and Giles across the threshold. Two men sat behind a massive hand-carved desk. One of the men behind the desk stood up. He was small and half-bald, and wore glasses to which was attached a thin black ribbon. His dress was neat and conservative. He smiled thinly. His name was Manuel Flores, and he was president of Mexico. The other man slowly got up. He was tall and swarthy, and wore a double row of campaign ribbons across his tunic. But even without them, even without his pea-green, snug-fitting uniform, you would have known he was a soldier. His name was Pedro Nolanti, and he was commander of the Army of the Republic. The president said, "Sit down, gentlemen." The Americans hardly had expected to hear their own language spoken by the president, and they looked at each other in mild surprise. The president observed their expressions and laughed. "I studied in your country, as did Montez. Nolanti also knows your language," the president said. Frost didn't know exactly what to say, but he said, "That's fine." The president went on, "Montez's message to us was welcome. Maybe we can help each other, see?" Frost said, "I hope so. Has General Nolanti made his plans?" Nolanti was a light opera military leader performing for a vast mob. He was perfectly accoutred. A highly polished Sam Brown belt came over a square shoulder and a heroic chest, and his bronzed throat muscles bulged under a collar that was none too loose. His fingers were thin and tapered, and on the little finger of his left hand he wore a heavy garnet ring. His forehead was deep, and his smile was cold and confident. His eyes struck the only false note in the ensemble. Frost noted they were shifty and darting. General Nolanti carefully explained the menace of this revolution. He related the insidious methods Tento had employed and told how the country in the north was in revolt. He has assembled about 2,000 men near about La Salada and Venado. Frost lifted his eyebrows. He said, "A large number of men to get together in a wild country, General." Nolanti admitted it. "But," he said, "they are there. Captain," he went on seriously, "the reason other revolutions have caused Mexico so much trouble was because the officers would sit and wonder how a rebel leader could muster an army. Instead, they should have done something about it." He extracted a long black cigarette from his pocket and lighted it. "I do not sit and wonder. I fight." He inhaled luxuriously. "I am moving troops today. To the north? See, to the north. There will be no trouble in the south." Nolanti laughed and said nothing. He regarded Frost in amusement. "Then, Captain, you should know Mexican rebels will not fight where there are no pulquerias. They must have tequila." "They have airplanes," Frost said. "A few, perhaps. So have we." Frost said, "How many?" "Several." Frost said, "How many are you going to use?" "3," said Nolanti. "Montez, you, and you." He indicated Giles. Frost wrinkled his brow and sat back in the chair. "Only 3?" "That is enough," Nolanti said. "I have good infantry." He said it with the doggedness old-line soldiers usually evidence when modern methods of warfare are mentioned. Frost bit his lip and Giles looked puzzled. Frost said, "You mean we are going into this revolution with only 3 airplanes?" His tone was incredulous. "Por qué no?" Nolanti blustered. He repeated, "I have good infantry." His sharp eyes darted about Frost. He had that peculiar sense which warned him of antagonism. He seemed to know that Frost knew he was merely playing a part, and, what was infinitely worse, overplaying it. The president felt something of the same tension, for he got up and said, "You gentlemen are here to get 2 prisoners. If you do get them, the revolution, or a big part of it, will be at an end." Abruptly he concluded, "It becomes my privilege, gentlemen, to appoint you coronels in the Army of Mexico." Frost said, "Thank you," and looked up. Something in the eyes of the president registered heavily on the American flyer. It might have been pathos. It might have been fatigue. Manuel Flores was involved in deep intrigue, and he was magnificently unprepared. The look Frost caught prompted the question, "Are the troops loyal?" Later he admitted that was not the proper thing to say. It came impetuously. The suddenness of the query startled Nolanti, and then he became composed and replied, "Quién sabe? One never knows." Frost said, "Yes." He looked at Giles and Giles nodded. The president said, "You have had a long trip," and extended his hand, which the Americans shook warmly. "As you Americanos say, good luck. Montez will attend you." On his way to the delayed bath and a change of uniform, Giles remarked to Frost, "The general has got a queer eye." Frost said, "So you noticed that too?" "Yeah, and I don't mind saying I think he's a lousy four-flusher. He couldn't command any army of mine." Frost regarded his companion with admiration. "Eddie," he said, "damned if you aren't getting intelligent." The Federalistas found no royal welcome awaiting them in La Salada, which is 20 miles west of Venado, on the Mexican National Railroad in the state of San Luis Potosi. It is absurdly easy to sit here and write 20 miles in a few motions of the fingers. And in some other country, it might have been only a little harder to negotiate. But not between La Salada and Venado. That score of miles which separates them lies through as wild and remote a section as Mexico holds, arroyos and canyons, no roads at all in some places. And crowning it all, a terrific sun that was very nearly unmerciful. Not once during the march, and the march, moving 3,000 troops with their provisions and ammunition trains in a single day, was not a mediocre military achievement. Did the Tento Cargadores, as Nolanti had contemptuously dubbed them, reveal their presence? The official communiqué had said the country would be filled with them and that sniping probably would be indulged in. Perhaps Tento's men were more clever than the Federalistas thought. Throughout the march, Nolanti's troops expected to be fired on, and mile after mile they trudged, their nerves taut. A brush, a skirmish, might have relieved their pent-up emotions. By the time they reached La Salada, they were in no mood for frolic. They shed their packs and took up their billets, exhausted. Only a hardy few consorted with the dancing girls in the pulquerias, the dancing girls who are, magically, always present on the Latin American battlefronts before the soldados. If the military leaders maintained an espionage system as elaborate as these girls, the results would be different. Unfortunately, La Salada was openly hostile to the men of the Republic. Weisberg and Jacobson, only officials of the Black Ship Gang now at large, unaware that their leader, Paul Parker, had been captured and executed, had carried out his propagandic ideas perfectly. They had convinced the somnolent citizens of La Salada, as they had thousands of others in the north, that Mexico's freedom depended on the Tento rebellion. Glorious liberty, they said, could come only from association with his ideals and by helping his men. It is never difficult to sell the ignorant peon a quantity of patriotism. Therefore, the name of Tento had been hoisted as a savior. The day after the federal invasion of the hostile town, 3 airplanes roared across a molten sky and dropped down on an improvised field almost within the confines of the village itself. One of them was a cabin plane, which was totally unfit for battle service, and bore, among other precious passengers, the person of General Pedro Nolanti. Another bore the trim figure of Captain Jerry Frost, and the third belonged to Eddie Giles. Both Americans were now clad in the green uniform of the Mexican Army staff and wore the insignia of coronets. They came into a town thick with the heat of the sun. It was the hour of the siesta. Not even the outrage of a federal invasion, not even Nolan's pompous proclamation of martial law could disturb that ritual. There would be plenty of time to worry about the indignities later. The sun hammered down so relentlessly it brought mirages before the eyes. It was a ghostly and unreal land of cavernous colors and glittering highlights. There even was a drowsiness in the slow clanging of the cathedral bell. The marketplace was ridiculously quiet. Old women slept before piles of unpatted tortillas. The keeper of a shop had gone to sleep sitting in his chair, and his head had fallen forward on his chest in grotesque fashion. General Nolanti and his men walked ahead and conversed in rapid tones. Behind him was Montez, and bringing up the rear were Frost and Giles, regarding the tomb-like village with true tourist curiosity. Giles mopped his head in a fashion that can only be described as unmilitary and said, "Why, am I hot?" Frost said banteringly, "Come back in the summer, then you'll find it really hot." Giles muttered, "It'll have to be a hell of a good show to make up for this." Then a silence fell between them. Conversation required too much effort, but Nolanti still conversed in that humming tone. He had a lot to talk about. Boots clattered noisily on the cobblestones. Then from somewhere came the bark of a pistol, so clear and loud and startling that it sounded like the crack of doom. Frost looked up quickly whence the sound had issued and got a glimpse, through a barred window, of a woman with a pistol in her hand. The silhouette was perfect, and almost immediately that silhouette vanished. Nolanti and the officer at his side stopped at once. Nolanti said, "Dios, did I not command all civilians to surrender their arms?" A storybook house disgorged 3 soldiers. One of them was buttoning his shirt. They saw the group of officers had stopped and went into a meek salute. "Go in," Nolanti said. "Arrest the person who fired that shot." Before the soldiers could comply, Frost had moved up quickly. He had gotten a glimpse of the woman, and he would have staked his life she was young. He said, "Would the general permit Colonel Giles and me?" Nolanti frowned at the interruption. The soldiers had not moved. "We saw her," Frost said. "We know," Nolanti said, "very well." He waved his hand, and the soldiers did a clumsy about-face and walked swiftly away. But by then Frost and Giles were crossing the street. Giles said, "You're crazy. This ain't our fight." Frost only smiled. His eyes were sympathetic. His heart was pounding lustily. He was tense with excitement. Adventure. Why didn't someone cheer? He wanted to beat his fists against the wall that surrounded the house and shout, "Adventure! This is adventure!" That was the way it got him. Sudden, cyclonic, all over. Chapter 2. The wall which protected the house was tall and thick, and the house sat back in the yard. At a single glance, Frost knew it was occupied by a personage. It was big and formal and aloof in its dignity. The gate was open, and they went through it, up the steps and into the hall. They entered a darkened interior, and for a moment they paused to adjust their eyes to the gloom. A man bumped against Frost, and he turned and grabbed him by the arm. It was a Federalista. His shoulder was blood-stained. Frost said, "What's the trouble, soldado?" "The woman had a pistol, muy coronel," General Nolanti ordered. "I know. Go get treatment. We'll arrest the woman." The soldier lamely saluted. Frost saw the red wave of blood had reached to his hand. Giles said to Frost, "I still think you're crazy." Frost laughed like a boy at play, and they went down the hall and into a room. Despite the brilliance of the mid-afternoon sun, a tiny candle burned before a crucifix in a nicho. Kneeling there was a woman. The smoke hardly had cleared from her pistol. She heard them enter and stood up. A vermilion shaft of light hammered through and outlined her figure. In a single glance, Frost noted she was young, breathtakingly young, and that the curves of her throat and breasts were superb. She slowly raised her hand. A pistol gleamed. Her eyes were fearless. "Pigs," she said. "Have you no respect for prayer?" Frost said, "An odd prayer, señorita, with a pistol in your hand." She said, "You will leave at once." "Gladly, after you give me your revolver. No civilian is permitted to have firearms." Her body trembled with anger. Her eyes flashed. Rage at taking dictation engulfed her. With a visible effort at self-control, she said, "One soldier already has been shot. I hope you will spare me the pleasure of shooting another." Resolution was written in every feature of her face. Pride is a stubborn master in high-caste Mexicans. There was no mistaking her meaning. In a moment she would fire. Frost leaped beside her in a sudden bound and wrested the revolver from her hand. He stepped back and looked at her. Her eyes now were coldly contemptuous. Frost bowed slightly. He said, "My apologies, but this is war. I should arrest you." She said between her teeth, "Swine, fit only to serve Nolanti, the butcher. Get out. Andale." Frost nodded to Giles and they walked out. In the street, Giles said, "Are all these dames like that?" Frost said soberly, "Most of them are." He looked at the revolver almost affectionately and put it in his hip pocket. "Maybe you should have arrested her," Giles said. "Shooting a soldier, even one of these soldiers, is pretty serious." Frost shook his head. "No, she doesn't belong in a military prison." He looked back at the house and thought he saw a form pressed against the window. He could have sworn he saw one. He would have sworn it was the girl. Hours later, when Nolanti received the report that one of his soldiers had been wounded by a civilian, and a woman at that, he went into a rage. He roared at his officers, swore at his men, and cursed the American flyers. He shouted, "Bring her here!" A little later, her identity was established, and the general became a dynamo of hatred, the daughter of the rebel Rubiez. "Dios!" he exclaimed. "Must I go myself?" He stamped the length of his narrow headquarters and recalled that not many years before, the name of Jose Rubiez had been one to conjure with in Mexico. A direct descendant of a long line of distinguished ancestors, owner of one of the largest and most prosperous ranchos in the country, he ruled in San Luis Potosi with a kindly hand. Guerrilla invasions had gradually cut his property, for there was no federal protection available. His vaqueros were killed, taxation had throttled him, and he had died with a prayer on his lips that God speed the Moses who was to bring liberty to his beloved people. His daughter was not at his deathbed, only a few of the vaqueros, a duenna. The Señorita Rubiez's train, transporting her home from school in the States, raced destiny, and, as so often is the case with those handicaps, lost. "Arrest her!" Nolanti shouted over and over, and arrest her they did. It was not difficult, for she offered no resistance. She made no complaint. It was as if she thought that might cheapen her. She went with the soldiers, but her soul seethed. She walked into Nolanti's headquarters ahead of the soldiers. There was hauteur in the tilt of her head and determination in the ring of her step. Frost and Giles were unaware of the action taken by Nolanti. If they had known, they would not have invaded headquarters so unceremoniously late that afternoon. They blundered, simply blundered, into the room. Frost saw her sitting there, and his heart looped. She regarded him without so much as a flicker of her eyelids. For all the martial atmosphere, she was a regal personage condescending to sit with her inferiors. She felt it. Nolanti felt it. His officers felt it, and they were uncomfortable. As Frost and Giles entered the room, Nolanti frowned. Frost said, "I beg your pardon. I did not know." His voice, strangely hard, chopped off the words. Nolanti hesitated briefly. He cloaked his annoyance behind a mask of inscrutability and said, "Come in." He did it as gracefully as the circumstances would permit. The flyers entered. "The Señorita Rubiez," Nolanti said, "is charged with assault on a federal soldier. I suppose," he added, "you are aware that she did shoot a soldier?" He looked directly at Frost, and the implication was quite patent. Frost's jaws snapped together. "Quite, sir, but I saw no reason." "Ah, of course not. And since when did you become the commanding officer?" He leered a little. "The Señorita Rubiez is—" He broke off his words as he looked at her. For a long time he feasted his eyes, and then he said suddenly, in a more dulcet tone, "Perhaps the crime is not so bad, eh?" He smiled. "Every charming woman should be privileged to shoot at least one soldier." He laughed, pleased with himself. His officers smiled. Nolanti, encouraged, went on, "Perhaps the senorita would appreciate the courtesy if General Nolanti dismissed her." Everyone in the room but the senorita knew what he meant. She gave no sign she had heard. She sat immovable. She did dart a swift glance at Frost, as if to make sure he was still present. Frost saw it. His heart looped again. With no more ado, Nolanti decided on his course of action. "Senorita, you may go. I am sorry my men arrested you. They shall be punished. And you would be wise if you could find leniency for General Nolanti." She did not stir until he had finished speaking. Then she rose and nodded. She murmured, "Gracias," in the same tone she employed to thank her servants, and swept from the room. There was silence in her wake. Nolanti's expression as she passed out the door was supercilious. It was purely a defensive smile. The sense of inferiority she forced on him was gone. There was a glint in Frost's eye. He experienced a surge of antipathy. His life heretofore had been free of women. He had been a soldier, and a soldier has no time for them. The following morning Montez entered the quarters of Frost and Giles. He was plainly excited. "The General wants to see you," he said. Frost got up heavily and walked across the narrow room, swimming in heat, to the bunk where Giles lay sleeping in a pool of perspiration. He slapped him on the shoulder and said, "Pile out, soldier." Giles blinked his eyes and sat up. He observed he was soaked. "Hell," he said. "Turn off the heat." Frost said, "Nolanti sent for us. Looks like work in the wind." Giles buttoned his shirt and laced his boots. He grunted and said, "What if Weisberg and Jacobson aren't in on this? What if they aren't?" Frost said, "Well, in that case, they just aren't. Looks like a hell of a chance we're taking to get 'em." Under his breath he said, "Damn." He looked up and went on, "Understand, I'm not shaky about it." He jerked his lace through a brass eye of his boot. "I just think it's a hell of a chance to take." Frost said, "Yeah? Well, you were pretty anxious to get down here." Giles pulled a crooked forefinger across his forehead and flung the sweat beads to the floor. "Sure, and I'm pretty anxious to get back, too." Frost let his eyes drift out the window towards the big house where the girl lived. "Yeah? Well, maybe I ought to agree with you, Eddie. Maybe I ought. But it's different. Too different. I hope the next revolution is at the North Pole." "Sure, but," Giles said, "hell." He was disgusted. "Let's go see his nibs." They found his nibs red-hot and ready. He hardly gave them time to get in the room before he fired. "How am I going to fight an enemy I can't locate? I want to know where they are. I want information, and at once." Frost said, "You mean reconnoiter?" "Exactly." "Very well." Without another word he turned on his heel and left the room, Giles behind. Giles said, "A swell way to run an army. Nix. Don't let it get your goat." Later, at the field, Giles said again, "A swell way to run an army." Frost said, "Crawl in. It'll be cooler where you're going." Was that meant for a dirty crack? Take it any way you want to, Duke. They spun their propellers, and the motors thundered in the still air. They got off the field in a flutter of wings and headed north. As they left the field and soared over La Salada, they could see beneath them the upturned faces of Nolanti's men, curious at the workings of an airplane in wartime. 15 miles to the north, Frost got his first glimpse of the men with whom Tento hoped to march into Mexico City. Over a rolling finca that was at one time a part of the vast holdings of Jose Rubies, the flyer caught sight of innumerable forms in the arroyos and canyons, who scurried to cover and resembled headless gnomes. They looked ready for action. Frost said to his instrument board, "This is no joke." He was frankly surprised. He had known the seeds of unrest which the gang had planted in the north had borne fruit, but not in his wildest dreams had he imagined it would be so productive. He looked across at Giles, who was riding abreast with his neat A3. Frost pointed below. Giles nodded. They conveyed their surprise to each other. To avoid pot shooting on the part of the rebels below, They remained high, but those rebels evidently had been given their orders. No shots were fired. Emboldened, Frost swept to within 1,500 feet of the ground to better view the surrounding country. Revolutionists were sprawled all about the entire finca. The focal point of this, the enemy territory, apparently lay in a small village which ostensibly had been one of old José Rubies's commissaries. As Frost and Giles swept over the scene, there was great confusion below, and they knew they had located the post command. Frost nosed around in a spanking breeze and came back at 1,000 feet. Suddenly, the chatter of a gun stabbed above the roar of the motor. He looked out. A knot of men manipulated a gun which spat rings of smoke. It was a machine gun. Frost said, "Damn!" He slapped his throttle open and zoomed into what was almost a stall. Then he flattened out and had a look through his binoculars. He could make out the forms below. "Headquarters," he said. "Sure as little apples." He looked at Giles, rolled his arm and flung it forward. He fell away in a glide and headed for La Salada. 30 minutes later he stood before Nolanti. "Well," said the general. Frost said, "They've got thousands of troops scattered about in the arroyos 15 miles to the north. Their headquarters are in a straight line northwest." He leveled his arm. "They've got the men, and there is considerable activity. I'd say they're ready to go any minute. Planes? None. But we've had brushes with this outfit before," Frost said soberly. "When the time comes, they'll have 'em. That's all." Frost paused a moment and said, "May I be so bold as to suggest our troops be assembled and held in readiness?" Nolanti said, "No, no." Frost and Giles wandered aimlessly along in the gathering dusk of early evening, restless and disgruntled, but not knowing what they could do about it. They had been hired for the show, and were burning with anxiety for action, and this opera bouffe general was cramping their style. Finding themselves presently before a gaudy restaurant, the Café Golondrina, they entered by common, tacit consent, and killed an hour or so over a hotly spiced meal. There was some stringed music, girls sang and made eyes. The place grew crowded with soldiers and noisier and rougher, but it wasn't particularly amusing to the present mood of the two soldiers of fortune. Afterwards, they walked slowly along the narrow street back towards their billet. The moon had come up full, and the world was bathed in ghostliness. A few soldiers loitered along. The only sounds were from the Café Golondrina behind them. Suddenly Giles said, "Jerry, what about Weisberg and Jacobson?" "Don't get in a hurry, my boy. I've got a plan all worked out. Tomorrow." He cut his speech off short as Giles laid a hand on his arm. They saw a slender form march briskly into the courtyard of the Rubies' home. It vanished in the shadows as if it had been suddenly swept off the face of the earth. Giles asked, "Get a slant at him?" "Yeah, and I don't like the looks of it a damned bit. He made a play to her this afternoon, and now he's come to see about it." They stopped at the gate and looked inside. In the window of the room where Frost had first seen the girl, there was a dim light. "Come on," Frost said grimly. They went inside and cautiously made their way to the side of the house. Frost whispered, "Get set for anything." Giles murmured, "Righto," and they stopped beneath the grated window. Presently they heard the voice of the general. He was employing his best voice this night. The girl dismissed her duenna tremulously. There was a pause, and Nolanti said, "Señorita, pardon the intrusion. I come to warn you, La Salada is no longer safe. The enemy," she cut in swiftly, "I do not fear the enemy without. It is the enemy within, the men of Nolanti, the butcher." Frost breathed. "Atta girl," Nolanti said severely. "That is no tone to take with me, but for me you might have faced the firing squad." The girl laughed. "I am not afraid. I come only to warn you. Still, I am not so hideous. There are women in Mexico. I am not one of those women," she said acidly. "And now will you go?" "Not yet," said Nolanti. "Not yet. Since you are so ungrateful, I shall show you how Nolanti." In a moment, there was a resounding slap as an open palm struck a cheek. Nolanti muttered an imprecation, and there were sounds of a struggle. The girl's short cries were laden with fear. Frost said to Giles, "I'm going in. Give me a boost." Giles locked his fingers together to form a step, and Frost slid up and reached for the iron grating above with his fingers. He pulled himself up and went through the window. Before either the girl or Nolanti was aware of his presence, he was within the room. Nolanti snarled and his hand dropped to his hip. "What are you doing here?" Before he could unbutton the flap of his holster to get his gun, Frost was beside him. He said, "It means, muy general, that your attentions are unwelcome." Nolanti pulled himself erect. He snapped, "You forget your place, soldado. I am General Nolanti, andale pronto." The girl stifled a sob and fell back a step or two. She lifted her eyes to Frost, and he saw, in the dim light of the candles, that the defiance she had earlier evinced, the contempt, was gone from her face. He was no longer to be regarded as an enemy. He saw it, and it fired him. He said, "Beat it, Nolanti. Get out." He was plainly trying to avert an open break with his superior officer, but his attitude was determined. Nolanti's eyes glittered. "You are insulting. I shall show you how, Nolanti." His hand went to his hip again. This time the flap was opened, the butt of the gun exposed. This time the general meant business. Frost recognized it was one or the other. He also went for his gun. Nolanti had the start of a fraction of a second. Just a fraction. Frost's life hung by that thread. And then there was a soft plump, and Nolanti's eyes popped open. He groaned and folded up on the floor like a Japanese lantern. As his body went down, it revealed, directly behind, another form. It was Eddie Giles. He was holding his pistol in the flat of his hand. He put it back in his holster. "I smashed him pretty hard," he observed dryly. Frost knelt beside the stricken man. "It was a wallop at that. Where'd you come from?" Giles said, "Hell, you need a nurse." Nolanti groaned and turned over on his side. He'd been hit hard. Giles had clubbed him over the temple, and blood streamed from a deep gash. Frost said to the señorita, "Get some water and a towel." She whisked out of the room, her nostrils dilated and her hands trembling. "This is liable to be bad business," Giles said. He looked at Frost and dropped the general's hand. "Women," he said pointedly, "are a damned nuisance. My God, you ought to know that by now." Frost said, "Cut it. I'm not a bit sorry, not even a little bit." The girl returned with a basin of water and a towel. Giles propped Nolanti's head in his arms, and Frost bathed the cut and tried to bring him back to consciousness. The girl had dropped on one knee beside Frost. He said, "I'm not sorry I came." She didn't say anything. She bestowed a reverent glance on the crucifix in the niche, as if it had been responsible for the intervention of the Americanos. Nolanti sat up and blinked his eyes. Giles was holding him. The girl said, "I should have gone to my brother in Mexico City, but the soldiers." The soft candlelight cast exquisite shadows over her face. Frost said, "Don't worry." Nolanti placed his hand against his head and looked about the room curiously, desperately seeking to penetrate the fog in his brain. He felt someone holding him and turned around and saw Giles. "You, eh?" From behind. He got to his feet and swayed as if he would fall again. Frost caught him. Nolanti said, "Gracias. I am glad to know how Americanos fight." He bowed curtly to the Señorita Rubies and wiped away the flow of blood from his eye. "1,000 pardons, Señorita." "Aye." Frost thought he had never seen so odd a sight. In the flickering shadows, Nolanti shifted unsteadily but vigorously tried to maintain his unctuous manner. Then suddenly, there was a blast of rifles in the street. Shouts and screams of surprise arose. The clarion notes of a bugle rang through the night. Nolanti stood erect as a tent pole. "Madre de Dios, the rebels!" He turned and dashed from the room, insensible to his wound. At every crack of the rifles, the girl flinched. Her face was being slowly drained of its color. Outside, a pandemonium reigned. La Salada was chaos. Frost said shortly, "Tento," and he damn well knew when to come. "Señorita, I will remain," she said resolutely, getting a grip on her emotions. "I am not afraid." "Then we remain," Frost said. "They will sack the town." "Viva Tento, viva Tento!" The shouts were in the hall of the house. Frost dashed to the door and slammed it. He dragged a table, which he shoved against it. Giles grabbed 2 chairs, and together they pulled out a cabinet. Frost said to the girl, "Go, hide." She looked at him for an instant, 72 inches of sinew, flushed in the candlelight, an automatic in his hand and the steel of battle in his eyes. She looked at him and left the room, unaware of the pounding at the door, the rifle fire in the street. Everything, Frost watched her disappear through a door. "Jerry!" Frost turned. "Give me a hand!" Giles was tugging at a huge Renaissance cabinet. They squared it around and crouched behind it. "Let 'em have it, Eddie." "Damn right!" The door creaked and burst in. Half a dozen swarthy faces appeared above the improvised barricade. Their rifles glinted in the yellow light. Crack! Crack! Twin jets of flame leaped across the space from the Americano's pistols. A voice boomed curses in the hall. The soldiers fell away. The doorway became mysteriously bare. The same voice surprised, "2 men!" and then loudly, "I call upon you to surrender in the name of Tento." Frost looked at Giles. Giles looked at Frost. "The big cheese himself," Giles said. "Well?" Frost said, "It's the wall any way we go." He raised his voice, "Come and get us." It is characteristic of adventurers to discount danger. Even the most extreme moments of peril do not so register. Frost, Giles too for that matter, had been in some tight spots. None had ever been tighter than this. Disaster was close. And yet there was little concern. They should have known their predicament was desperate. There was a pause, broken only by the scurrying of footsteps in the hall. An order was barked in Spanish. A moment later, Frost crawled to the window. A dozen soldiers were moving in from the street, their purpose all too plain. He and Giles were trapped. He backed slowly to the cabinet and dropped down on his haunches. He said softly, "Looks bad. They're surrounding the house. Keep an eye on the window." Giles said, "Righto. If this is the finish, we'll go in a blaze." He laughed shortly. "I was just thinking about that picture show we saw a couple of weeks ago, where that ranger got in a closet and shot it out with the rustlers. Things like that do happen, I guess." A head appeared over the barricade. Frost nudged Giles. Giles stopped speaking. Frost snapped his automatic up and squeezed the trigger. The body pitched forward and hung across the top of a chair. "3," Frost said. There was a fervid oath from the corridor in that same heavy voice they had identified as Tento's. "Madre de Dios." It checked itself there, and presently another voice was heard. It came from a safe retreat. "Machine guns are here, muy coronel. Will you come out?" Frost said, "Nolanti." Eddie, the louse sold out. The damn traitor. He marched these men into a trap. No wonder he didn't want to fight until tomorrow. "Yeah, Nolanti." Giles raised his head and shouted, "Go!" Frost clapped his hand over his mouth and said, "Wait a minute." Then, "We're gone ducks this way. Want to take a chance the other way? We're Americans, you know." "Yeah, but a hell of a lot of good that'll do you now." "We got in with 'em, and—" Frost cut him short with a shout, "We'll come out. Throw your pistols out the door." 2 automatics went sailing through the air and through the door. A moment later, the soldiers cleared a path for Nolanti. He was no longer the immaculate actor. His uniform was blood-stained and bedraggled, and his head was swathed in a bandage. He resembled a desert chieftain. Behind him came Tento, a hulking figure with fierce mustachios, and half a dozen soldiers. Nolanti made no effort to suppress his pleasure. Frost looked at him and said, "You damned louse." "Ah, yes, but as you Americanos say, all's fair in love and war," he said proudly. "Ah," there was a trace of fanaticism in his eyes now. He said, "Tomorrow we amuse you with a court-martial." Rifle fire punctuated his speech. The bell in the cathedral kept up its frenzied ringing. It set a mad tempo for the scene in the streets. Tento's followers had the advantage of preparation and a night move. They knew exactly when and where to strike. The faithful Federalistas, routed in a surprise attack, went into action with little will and no sort of direction. The firing was vigorous. Whenever rebels and Federals met, the streets became narrow battlefields. Neither side gave way until the other had been exterminated. Some combatants, too close for rifles and pistols, closed in with knives. And above the rifle fire, the confusion, the shots, the ringing of the bell, came the shouts, "Viva Tento!" It was a quick and complete rout. By the light of torches, Nolanti and Tento rode among the men until the first trace of dawn, the one pompous and confident, the other wounded but clinging to his purpose with a tenacity almost superb, both haranguing the men of the government. Latin American warfare is largely a matter of oratory anyway. By morning, the Federalistas who had survived became rebels, and Mexico City loomed close at hand. It was a wave that gathered speed and size as it went on, the red fires of rebellion. But the little Flores, unused to governing a republic of such deep intrigue, had placed implicit faith in a more powerful guidance. That very night, he got some sort of divine inspiration. He flashed orders from his bedroom in the Castillo de Chapultepec for 5,000 additional men to be mustered into service. Queer? Not at all. History is filled with such premonitions. Chapter 3. Accustomed as he was to military pomp, any court-martial in which Nolanti had a hand would be, of necessity, impressive. The next morning, he gathered a small but select tribunal in the wide drawing-room of the Rubia's home, which now was headquarters. There was Tento himself, his barrel chest bulging, his mustachios running wild like villas, who was, incidentally, Tento's military hero. Next sat Nolanti, his appearance slightly more at ease, his head still bandaged, and there were 3 other officers nondescript in appearance, who were there to furnish atmosphere for the little drama and background for Nolanti. Tento, big and gruff and brutal, had roundly complained of the stage setting. He had insisted the formality of a trial was unnecessary. Tento's policy was to shoot them where they stood. He had protested, he still did. "General, this is the whim of an old man," he said bluntly. "No," said Nolanti. "Perhaps they can be influenced, mon jefe. They could help us. They will see we mean business." Still, Tento was not satisfied. "Perhaps. Perhaps. Do you think they will join us?" "Quien sabe?" Nolanti lifted his shoulders. "Maybe." Tento bestowed a tolerant glance upon him. "You do not know fighting men well, amigo. The Americanos will laugh." 2 other men entered the room. One was of medium height, who walked jerkily, a man past middle age. The other was constructed along sturdy lines and was red-haired. Tento and Nolanti both rose as they entered the room. The middle-aged man said, "Where are the prisoners?" Tento said, "They will be here shortly." "Damned nonsense. Why all this play?" He snorted. "They should have been killed last night." The red-haired man put in, "I'm telling you again, I don't like this. Bumping off a couple of Americans is no cinch. We are getting into a mess." Tento said, "Poof," as the middle-aged man nodded approvingly. Tento held up 2 fingers. It was the most insulting gesture known below the border. Tento said again, "Poof." There was a sound of boots on the floor and 4 soldiers escorted Frost and Giles into the room. The flyers abruptly came to a halt as they looked upon the men grouped around the table. Frost was surprised to see the 2 men in civilian clothes. He knew them, Weisberg and Jacobson, the 2 remaining members of the Black Ship gang still at large. Weisberg smiled. Perhaps smile is not the word. It was more of a smirk. He noted Frost's expression and said, "I see you remember me." Frost said nothing. Weisberg went on, "This time there will be no monkey business." His face was bland, but there was steel in his words. Frost looked upon the men with a certain grimness. This was to be no court-martial. This merely was a prelude to murder. Tento said to the soldiers, "Vamos, andale," just as a bit of bravado, and they went gladly. There was more fun in the pulquerias anyway. Without moving his head, Tento said, "You Americanos are charged with murder. Have you anything to say?" Frost grinned. "I'd like to have the rope if you don't mind. I know Mexican marksmanship too well." Nolanti bristled and a smile played around the corners of Tento's mouth. He shook his leonine head in mock sadness. "What a pity," he said. "Your sense of humor." He shook his head again and turned to Nolanti. "You, General, will pronounce sentence." Frost's heart dropped like a plummet. He said, "You know what this will mean? Uncle Sam." "Poof," said Tento. Weisberg snapped, "We have waited a long time for you, Frost, a long time." Nolanti laced his fingers and leaned forward. Before he could open his mouth, a crisp whisper filled the room. "Hands up, senors." Two forms stood in a side doorway. One was the Señorita Rubies. The other was Captain Montez. "A single move, and you are dead men." The girl and Montez both had leveled their pistols. Montez commanded, "Stand up, senors," in an excessively polite tone. The officers got to their feet. Montez said to Frost, "Take their guns." Now fully alive, Frost and Giles moved among them and took their revolvers swiftly. When they were disarmed, the flyers stepped back. Tento blustered, "I could raise my voice." "And stop a slug with your head," Giles finished. He covered Tento with Tento's own gun. Montez said, "And the next time, senors, your men should search the cellar." Nolanti, almost apoplectic with impotent rage, twisted his heavy garnet ring nervously around his finger. He was an actor and a traitor, and he was frightened. But he was not stupid. He did not wonder how Montez and the girl had hid in the cellar all night, nor why the beautiful señorita seemed so interested in the cause. Nolanti didn't wonder because he didn't care. It had happened. Threats would be absurd. So he said, "Capitan, you should know how helpless you are. The old regime is doomed. Now if you would care to—" "I don't," Montez said. By now Frost had come closer to the Señorita Rubies. It was no time to indulge in greetings. Yet he said, "How did this happen?" For an instant a trace of a smile lighted her face. A Japanese carver of ivory might have caught the exquisiteness of her profile and the curve of her lips. She said, "I am a soldadera. I owed you a debt. I have tried to repay." Frost mumbled, "Yes, yes." He turned away. There were many things to say. He had never wanted to say such things before, but he forced himself to turn away. He was a soldier, a fighting man. What had Giles said? Women are a damned nuisance. They weren't really. Not to everybody, but to a fighting man. Frost shut the picture of the beautiful señorita from his mind and remembered his job ahead. Tento had spread his hulk in a high-backed Spanish chair. He was uneasy. He was restless as an animal. And Nolanti was far from being at ease. The slender traitor recognized the approach of something like his fate. The actor playing the dual role he loved and in which he excelled, and playing it with finesse right down to the finish, sat in this great broad room awaiting whatever was to come. He was like a rabbit in a trap. A life that so long had been conducted for his benefit alone had slipped upside down. Weisberg and Jacobson looked on through narrowed eyes. They had faced the guns of Jerry Frost before, and they knew the man. Once they had escaped, but they knew they could not again. The next time Frost would say it with lead. The three other Mexicans were mere puppets, and they knew it. They said nothing and sat immovable while the drama played itself swiftly before them. Montez and the Señorita Rubiz had burst into the room in a moment of sheer impetuosity. He had waited until the soldiers had left the room and gone elsewhere. There were no other sentries. It is doubtful if the gallant officer had thought ahead of that move. What was to happen inside, how he would extricate himself and his friends, evidently had been of no immediate concern. Companionships are welded by dangers. Montez's two companions were in danger. That was all that mattered. Somehow, Frost sensed Montez had exhausted his resources. The brave Mexican could think no further. He seemed to have no conception of what to do next. And Frost knew that delay was dangerous, terribly dangerous. Their lives depended on speed. He said to the Señorita, "Get some rope, cord, anything, and some rags. Have you some rope?" She nodded. "Hurry!" Frost gestured with his pistol at one of the Mexican officers. "Stand up and undress." He turned to Giles. "Eddie, block the door." He looked back at the Mexican and snapped, "Go on, pull off your pants and blouse." The Mexican slipped out of his blouse and pulled off his pants. He presented rather an incongruous picture there in the room. His comrades looked on, puzzled. "Montez, put on that uniform. Give him yours." Montez caught the idea and hurriedly changed clothes. Two stood guard while the other exchanged uniforms. The fit of the khaki left something to be desired, but no attention was paid to that. When the Señorita Rubiz returned to the room, she found Montez, Frost, and Giles in the brown of the rebel army. She saw the rebel officers wearing the pea green of the federal forces, and in a moment, she knew what had happened. She made no comment. Frost said to them, "Signors, our position is quite like yours, desperate. It is your life or ours, and we have no scruples against blowing off the top of your heads. The first slip and hell gets turned loose." The Señorita handed him a quantity of rope and a skirt. She handed them to him with the air of a soldier who completes a mysterious mission successfully and asks no questions. Frost handed it over to Giles without taking his eyes off the group. "Tie him up, Eddie, and gag him. Watch the door, Montez. Eddie, all but Weisberg and Jacobson. We'll take them with us." Giles went immediately to work. He hummed a bar or two as he tied up the officers. He gagged them effectively. Nobody offered any resistance. The leveled guns cowed them. Giles stretched them on the floor and admired his handiwork. Weisberg and Jacobson fidgeted nervously. Weisberg said, "You can't get away with it, Frost. You can't get away with it." Frost said, "No. Get this and get it in a hurry. We're going back to the flying field, see? You'll go, and like it. No more chances with you. The next time I bump you off myself, see?" Frost's eyes were blazing, and his voice was hard. He had not forgotten the escape of the Black Ship gang from an express train months before, at the cost of 2 Rangers' lives. "Now get up and shove off. We'll send an army back after the others." It was a strange procession that emerged a little later from the house of Rubiz, and yet it was not so strange at that. Jacobson and Weisberg came out first, and in the rear were Frost and Giles and Montez and the girl. Coming through the iron gate, Frost said, "Right through the skull if it comes to a showdown." Giles said, "Righto." They walked briskly into the street, into a sun that was brutal in its intensity, and headed for the improvised flying field. Soldiers stepped aside and saluted mechanically. Not a one of them so much as looked twice. Weisberg and Jacobson occasionally lifted their eyes to the skies. Frost said to Giles, "Black ships are due." Giles didn't say anything. Frost increased the cadence. He was nervous. His heart was not normal. He was in a tough spot. The girl complicated the situation. Giles had been right about women. As they reached the field, the guards moved away from the planes. Frost stopped Weisberg and Jacobson beside the cabin plane in which Nolanti and his staff had been transported to La Salada. Frost said quietly, "Get in the plane. Eddie, you ride with them and take Miss Rubiz, and let the lead go at the first sign of monkey business." "Sure," said Giles, "but I hate to leave my little ship. I hate "Nix," Frost interrupted. "We're in a hurry, and if anything happens, see that these prisoners get through." Montez got in and sat down at the controls. The starter whirred, and then the motor skyrocketed into explosions. Giles and the girl got in and sat in the rear of the cabin. Frost motioned for Weisberg and Jacobson to get in. They did. As the cabin plane pulled off, Frost stood just clear of the slipstream and raised his hand. Montez got away in a rush, and Frost went over to his ship and took his helmet off the accelerator knob. He pulled it down over his forehead insouciantly and tucked in his ears. He looked behind him at the village of La Salada, sprawled in the sun like an ugly wound. Soldiers, tasting a triumph, eager to move, waiting for orders. But these orders would be late. Frost walked to his plane, wound the starter, and got in. 1,500 feet up, he saw that Montez was holding his throttle open. The nose of the cabin plane was up, and the ship had gone into a long climb, pointing roughly south by east. Its motor was blowing black rings through the exhausts. The swaying of the craft itself in the bumpy channels indicated excessive speed. Within that plane sat two members of a gang that had given the state of Texas more trouble than any other combine in the turbulent history of the Lone Star State. They had been guilty of murder, robbery, counterfeiting, smuggling, violation of the Neutrality Act between the United States and Mexico. They had run the length and breadth of the criminal statutes. As he roared through the air, Frost found it difficult to grasp the full significance of his capture. It had gone on so long he could hardly realize it was ended. It was a dream. The two surviving members captured, the others dead or in prison. It had been a long fight, a long, long fight. Weisberg and Jacobson, the last two. Montez's cabin plane took a gap in the clouds at 6,000 feet, and Frost sat on its tail and pulled through directly behind. Above, the sun was shining brightly, so brightly it nearly blinded him. The ground was visible only in smudges of dark brown. At intervals, Frost swept the sky on a level with his eye. Then he began systematically to search in layers. He had an uneasy feeling. For the life of him, he could force it into no definite fear. It was just a sort of blend of caution and intuition. Frost didn't stop to analyze it. He merely accepted it and let it go at that. It is possible that the onrush of victory, after so long a fight, might have been predominant in the wave of uneasiness. He flew on and on. He looked at his airspeed indicator, 110. Montez was setting a fast pace. San Luis Potosi unrolled beneath. The white-tiled buildings flashed in the sun. The plaza was crowded. Beyond, there were tiny settlements that resembled mere dots. Long ago, they had been burned into insensibility, and there was no place on the map for them. Halfway to Mexico City, near Celaya in the state of Guanajuato. Frost's subconscious fears welled into a crystallized mass that chilled him to his ankles. It was like coming out of a nightmare and sitting up stark in a shadowed room. There is nothing so completely unnerving. The enemy. It is possible that before he kicked his rudder around, he looked back and saw them. Later, he said he wasn't sure whether he acted when the hunch hit him or when he saw the planes. At any rate, he perceived two dots hanging on the lower edge of the sun. They hadn't been there a moment ago. It was as if the sun had spawned them. He did not attempt to surmise how they were so soon in pursuit. He remembered seeing Weisberg and Jacobson glancing upward. He didn't think those two planes were in the northern sky when they took off, but with his attention on Montez's ship, he could not be certain. Anyway, that was past now. Other matters of the moment were more pressing. Frost slid off on a wing and picked up the bright flash of his pursuers. He loaded his guns methodically. The coldness he had felt a moment ago was gone. In its place had come a comfortable glow. He opened his throttle and went into a climb, straight into the sun. He put up the ball of his thumb to shut out the blazing inferno. His heart was beating faster, but he was not conscious of it. His temples felt tight. He pushed his goggles up. No goggles while firing. He looked up and around, but saw only those two planes. One of them was 2,000 feet higher than the other, and half a mile away. He had the sun and the altitude. He knew it. He nosed over and came down like a comet. Frost pulled up sharply, did a quick climbing turn, and faced the black ship head-on. An old trick. Let him know immediately you've got guts. A big help sometimes. Air fighting deals a lot with the other fellow's psychology. Frost opened his side cover and pressed the trigger. Both guns vomited a stream of lead. The black ship's pilot held his fire a trifle too long, and in a split second, Frost had driven out of range. The black ship swept by, and Frost half-rolled to get on top and went high in the climb. Montez had observed Frost's predicament. He knew the two black ships were trying to pocket him, catch him on the intersecting line, and let go. It was first-grade air stuff, and Montez thought Frost was certain to be trapped. He lost speed, and his big ship was loafing along at 8,000 or 9,000 feet, half a mile away. Frost saw it and swore at his instrument board. He said, "The fool! Why doesn't he run for it?" From high above, he saw that the second black ship had spotted the cabin plane and had darted for it like a falcon. Frost waggled his wings in a desperate signal to get away, but it was not seen. "The fool! Oh, the damned fool!" he swore. He kicked his bus over in a dive. 115, 120, 125, 130, 140, 145, 150, vengefully 160. The wires screamed in the wind. He could not hear his guns chatter. He knew they were working only because he could see the crank arms moving. He was hammering at the black ship in short bursts of 10. The enemy was visible in his ring sight. The next moment, it had disappeared. The pilot had turned in a wild split air to miss the lead. Frost stalled and whipped out in a spin. He ruddered out of the spin and ran his stick through a slow ellipse. He leveled off and streaked away, threw himself up and over in an Immelman turn, and came out with his guns barking. Eddie Giles, peering through the narrow slot of a window in the cabin plane, his face grim and his upper lip in his teeth, muttered, "God, what a pilot! I never saw anything like that before." Frost was thinking clearly. He was perfectly coordinated. There was, nevertheless, blood in his eye. They say the ideal ace is a high-strung, impetuous chap who goes wild, a hellion ripping and smashing in brilliant maneuvers. Perhaps. Certainly in this fight, Jerry Frost was anything but that. He was cold, calm, and deliberate, and he knew he had never engaged in a scrap so technically perfect. He had the wind in his hair and a taste of the clouds on his lip. He closed in on the black ship, and as he rolled over, he had a glimpse of the ground, a great grey scarf that stretched as far as he could see. The other machine split-aired for a frantic second and let go its guns. A storm of bullets clawed at Frost's plane, and white-hot needles stung him in the shoulder. Something warm trickled down his arm. He was hit. "Damn," he said. "Damn." There came that tightening of the throat, that ghastly wound that never quite heals, the fear of men who fly. This was the way it got them, in a flash. For a moment, it jumped in every fibre of his body. For just a moment, it was too devastating a force, and Frost knew it. He had to beat it as quickly as it had come. His hand reached for the trigger control as he pulled up into a half-loop, his fabric flaying in the breeze. The black ship flew squarely through his smoky line of fire. That was all. It flopped once, and a puff of amberish smoke ripped away from it. It stalled madly and side-slipped to whip the flames away from the cockpit. The pilot was up now, with a leg over the side, groping blindly for a foothold on the edge of the lower wing. Then the burning machine slid out of the slip, and the flames swept down the fuselage. The pilot hesitated and then flung himself off into 10,000 feet of space. Frost thought, tough to go like that. Tough, damned tough. Mustn't look at him, might do things to my throat. Won't look. Funny, how he twists and turns. Frost blinked his eyes. For the first time he was conscious they stung fearfully. He wiped away the tears on the coat sleeve of the khaki uniform. Then he saw it and remembered it was a rebel soldier's garb. He laughed aloud. Funny. Damned funny. He looked out and saw the other black ship streaking for the cabin plane. Montez was flying like mad. Frost opened his throttle, and his machine leaped ahead. The fabric ribboned back in the breeze as he eased the stick back and went into a gradual climb. The pilot of the black ship was unaware of the fate of his companion. He was close beside the cabin plane now, trying to get across some sort of a signal. He knew his superiors rode in that ship. Inside the cabin plane, there was some confusion. They had seen Frost's fight, Weisberg and Jacobson with ominous, brooding eyes, and Señorita Rubiez slumped in her seat from the excitement. Giles darted swift glances from the prisoners to the ships outside. Weisberg was sitting ahead of the girl. In the excitement, she had laid her pistol in her lap. Weisberg had seen it. He slowly shifted his position, and in a flash he had pivoted quickly. His hand darted for the weapon. But Giles had seen. Crack! The cabin was lighted by a momentary flash, and a puff of smoke rolled by the girl's face. She screamed and jumped. Weisberg groaned, and the reflex jerked his arm back in a convulsive movement. It dangled helplessly beside him. The bullet had smashed his elbow. "Sit still!" Giles shouted. Jacobson swore roundly, and the black ship pulled closer. Giles leaned over the señorita and said, "Steady." He leveled his arm across her and broke the glass with the barrel of his gun. The air rushed in and tore at her hair. The black ship's pilot saw the movement and reached for his own pistol. Crack! It wasn't a difficult shot, with the two planes side by side and at the same rate of speed. Giles fired again, and the pilot threw up both hands and slid forward like a sack of meal. The black ship dived from sight. Outside, there was another roar, a threnody of victory. The nose of Frost's ship appeared. He looked across and nodded in wide, slow movements. He opened his mouth and slowly formed the words, "Okay." He threw one arm forward, holding the stick between his knees, and Giles waved his hand. Giles shouted ahead to Montez, "Step on it!" Giles did not notice Frost sunk low in his cockpit. He screened his shoulder from the eyes in the other plane. His shoulder was badly hit. Blood was streaming from it. It seemed to Frost they flew on forever before the snow-capped peak of Popocatépetl emerged from the eternal mists which surrounded it. He was tired. He had not slept the night before. He had stayed awake in that narrow jail, devising an escape, and his shoulder pinched like the first faint gnawing of cancer. He was seized with a mad desire to close his eyes. The lids were like lead. He laughed to himself. Joke on him. Eyes heavy. Ha, ha, ha. Funniest thing in the world. There was the field. Right below. Montez down. And Giles was with the prisoners. Good. Old Eddie. Eddie said women were a damned nuisance. No woman ever looked at Eddie the way the señorita looked at him. Going down. Got to hurry. Couldn't keep eyes open. Couldn't fly like this with a shoulder knocked all to hell and back. He chuckled a bit to think of that. Silly to think of flying when a shoulder was knocked all to hell and back. He yanked his eyes open. He saw a streak of ground flicker through his struts. Faces, white faces upturned. He yanked back his stick. God, the damned thing was heavy. Must have an elephant on the elevators. Like turning a truck. Never been that heavy before. Something was wrong. Somebody was sitting on the elevators. Get the hell off there. Got to look and see. He felt a crash, and his head shot forward, and he remembered throwing up his arm to keep his teeth from being bashed out against the cowl. It was dark, very dark, except for a single spot of light way off in the distance. He moved. Something cool touched his forehead. He muttered, "Everything is okay?" There was a whisper. He saw something. He couldn't make out what it was. "Everything is okay?" A voice said, Sure, okay. He tried to move. His left side was stiff. Muscles had stuck together. What the hell? He stirred again. No luck. He opened his eyes. He closed them and then opened them again. Where am I? He said. What's the matter? Then, never mind. He sat up suddenly and winced from the pain. Lay down. A voice said, Be still. He laughed. Still? What the hell still? I'm okay. He laughed again. I'm all right. He twisted his head to get a squint at his shoulder. It was taped in bandages. He grinned. I'm all right. Then he saw faces. Giles, Montez. A man in a white coat with a stethoscope draped from his neck. Another face. A little round face. He had seen that face before. Now with the devil. Sure, the Presidente. The face was coming towards him. Montez stepped forward and whispered, El Presidente. Frost said, Sure. The little man was ridden with emotion. He tried to speak, but the words clogged in his throat. His hands trembled. He finally managed, Gracias, muy amigo. Gracias. That was all he could say. Frost grinned. Nix, I want to get up. Hell, I'm okay. He looked at Giles. Hello, Limey. Everything set? Giles smiled and came closer. Yeah. Weisberg and Jacobson are on their way to the border with a special guard the President appointed. And say, the troops captured Tento and Nolanti. I've got you an invitation to a little shooting party. Huh? How long have I been in here? Giles said, Long enough. Senorita Rubies emerged from the background, and Frost again saw the exquisite shadows on her face. His shoulder was throbbing, but not too much for him to think, I could fall for this dame like nobody's business if I had time. It's too bad I'm a soldier. Senorita Rubies indicated a young man in his late 20s, a young man of proud demeanor. She said, My brother, and he stepped forward and bowed cordially. My thanks, sir. My sister. Nix, Frost said. Nix. End of Headfirst into Hell by Horace Mccoy.